So I have previously given this presentation at a different user group, and that's kind of the end of the REST presentation and blah, blah, blah. The fun stuff is this. This is the stuff that there's a couple of slides for each topic, and it's just some of those things that you're going to run into, some things that make you go, Because as you start reading some of these books and start implementing, you start running into the things we're about to talk about. All right, I've already mentioned this. REST is a set of principles and not a specification. Remember put? Sometimes put updates, sometimes put posts, or creates rather. Sometimes it's a patch instead of a put. Sometimes put's not supported. It's a specification, not a standard. So you will find, as you go out and look at sample REST APIs, you will find that not every one of them is implemented consistently. Read the documentation. Again, Netflix does a pretty darn good job, in my opinion, of adhering to the REST set of specifications pretty purely, but they still don't do it as well as I think they should. But again, I mean, I'm nobody. I've just read some books and Dr. Fielding stuff and had some conversations and got feedback from audiences, and I'm not Netflix. At the end of the day, it comes down to what works for you, what works for your developers, and as long as it's documented, we're good. Yes?
So if put's not supported, will it send back a 500, or is there an actual code specifically for that?
It depends on how you implemented the API, but you should send back a 503, not a or 504, whatever that code is.
But
I apologize if I'm butchering the codes.
Is that really a not implemented, or since it's actually just saying put is not supported at all?
Well, that's true.
Again,
Again, it depends.
Not implemented implies that you're actually going to build something.
It's a good point. It depends on how you want your. And this is where you get into this concept right here.
It's just up to however you want
document.
To yeah.
It's. I agree. I would say that it should be. Yeah, it should be not implemented because I agree. I would interpret that, now that you convinced me, as being something perhaps yet to be coming, versus something we're never going to support. Semantics.
Yeah.
But yeah, absolutely. So just be consistent with your users. All right. How do you specify formatted responses? So different topic now. So I want to get my response back in XML instead of JSON by the default. I can use the content type header. That's what you should use. However, you will see a lot of REST APIs that support something like this. It's also valid. Specification, not the standard. The specification does not say that you can't do that. The purest way of thinking is you should do it through content type headers. But again, as a developer consuming your API, we've all been in a situation like this. Well, I know how it should be done, but this blankety-blank piece of crap software that our boss thought we had to have won't let me set blankety-blank content type headers. What the hell do I do now? As a developer of an API, if both of these are acceptable, just support both of them. In your documentation, strongly recommend they do it the right way. But tell them, hey, you've got a sucky, work environment like all of us do, and this is the only way you can do it. And go right ahead and send it this way also. Be nice to your other developers.
What are the downsides of doing it in the UI?
It's just, in this particular case, there really isn't one, other than if you don't have a strong mental fix on what REST is, you're now going to say, oh, well, hell, I can throw a date range on here, an ID, and because somebody's going to look at that and go, well, that's just a normal URL. I can just bastardize the hell out of it. They don't understand that it's REST and that you really shouldn't have it this way. You can have parameters on the URI in REST, but you're supposed to do as much as possible through the headers and through the message response and the representations. That's the spirit of REST. Right, wrong, etc. All right, what if you want to, so we already talked about this. I want to be able to send XML, but I want to be able to get back JavaScript. Again, be friendly to your developers. There's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be able to, you shouldn't support this, in my opinion. Again, there's not an answer. Be nice. All right, something else that I have ran across as well. You will find that there are some proxies that are more than happy to strip out some of your headers for you. So they'll give you the ones they think you need, but maybe some of the other ones, they're just not going to send you. So again, be nice to your developers. In my opinion, and this is just my opinion, what does it hurt to represent the headers in your response body also? So that way if the consuming client needs to go there to get them, they can get them. Now we don't need to worry about content length or keep alive, none of that stuff. That has nothing to do with our REST. That's server response. But the stuff that matters, what's our response code? What's our vary header? You know, the important ones. If it's an error, well, we'll come back to that, I'm sorry. So I would recommend, again, just personal recommendation, I have a blog post at notmessenger.com that talks about this more in depth. A lot of the authors of the books, of the people that I just told you I read, you know, we got into a conversation about some of this stuff, so there's some more good reading on there about these types of things. You know, someone like, that's not pure at all. Dr. Phil would never mention that, and I agree. And I would like to think I've tried to, if I was going to take the time to implement a REST API, I was going to take the time to understand it and try to be as pure as possible. I agree that that's not pure. But at the end of the day, I also want to maintain my sanity. And if I was a consumer developer and for whatever reason, some piece of equipment between here and there was messing with this, I'm not going to be happy. So, you know, again, just, what does it hurt? Be nice. In my opinion. All right, something else. This is a URL that you should all write down. This is a workflow for a REST request. I dissected this into several pieces and blew it up and wrote on each one what was what and how and where and when. And I've got a bigger one I can pull up here. But if you go to the URL, you can, you can look at this. So I'll bring the URL back in just a second. Let me show you this file. It is right here. All right, so if I pull it over here and I zoom in a lot, and I scroll over. Okay, very first thing, a request comes in. Is it available? Yes or no? If it's a no, 503, service unavailable. If it is available, is the URI too long? Are they trying to send too much information? Perhaps you've got a restriction on the amount of data that can be sent. If it's too long, 414, request URI too long. If it's not, is it malformed? Is it authorized? Yada, yada, yada. You don't have to implement all of these, but it gives you a good feel for if you were to implement authorization, this is the point in the process you should be responding. Don't wait till you've sent back the payload and said, oh, by the way, don't read this. That's the wrong time to be addressing it.
Do you happen to know that they asked the questions in that order? Is that a server-side implementation question?
This is server-side implementation. It's however you want to implement. When I have my REST API, I don't bother asking some of these questions. Right now, I don't have authorization built into my demo, so I don't even bother doing any of this authorized. But I also know who's consuming it.
Right.
And it's documented. Let me grab my scroll bar here. And I'll bring you back to the URL in a second, because you really should. So what happens if somebody asks for options? What happens if they ask for, are any of these supported? What happens if the resource exists? Now, I'm not implementing any of this. This is the e-tag and the caching. Does the resource already exist? Is there already representation I can send back instead of asking for it again? I've got to get the server involved at a much lower level than I currently have it involved in my application. I want to one day implement this, but as of right now, I don't support a resource exists question. I reply back with a 503 not implemented. If your client code asks me, does the resource exist? I'm going to tell you, I'm not implementing that functionality. Because I'm not implementing it right now.
Would you do some of that in Apache or
Yeah.
all of that?
Preferably. Because you don't want it to get your MVC stack to have to figure this stuff out. You want Apache to do it. So you want to use like a mod cache to take care of some of this stuff. You can use the mod expires, they've got the e-tags. And I got to do a lot more research. I know conceptually how it should be done, but implementing it's going to be a whole other type of thing. So again, don't worry about premature optimization. When I was building all this out, the last thing I needed to worry about was whether or not I was hitting 2 more requests. I needed a freaking API that could serve something. I'll worry about caching and optimization later. So that's why I just haven't gotten to it yet. So anyway, you get the idea here. Let me go back to here so you can get the URI again if you don't have it. I strongly recommend getting this graphic. It is humongous, as you can tell. But immensely useful. Because I read about 3 books and went, oh my good golly. And I had a bunch of stuff written down and trying to figure it out on my own. I was like, this just hurts. And then I forget where I came across this, but I was like, oh, this is awesome. I wouldn't shut up about it for like a week. Because I could throw away all my pieces of paper. And then when I was reading the books, it just made the books make so much more sense. Because I finally understood what part they were talking about when and how and why. So, does anybody not have that written down that wants it? Okay. Totally different topic now. Versioning. This one, let's see what we have in time here. Oh, we're good. This will be an actual 9 o'clock presentation. All right, versioning of resources. So, versioning is one of those topics, and if you go read my blog post, this one got very interesting. Versioning is one of those topics that everybody has an opinion, nobody agrees, and it's probably the most contentious part of REST in my opinion. Because Dr. Fielding didn't really talk about it a whole lot, so nobody can say, oh, well, this is what the intention was, etc. So let me talk about a few of the basic things, and then we'll get into why it's interesting. There are really only two ways to implement the concept of versioning in your API. You can either use HTTP headers, or you can do it in the syntax of the URI. Now, obviously, based on what I said earlier, you should be using HTTP headers for it, and not URI. Except for I disagree with myself on this one, and you shouldn't be using headers. So, here's why. If you're using HTTP headers, one of the ways that is presented in the community is that we should be creating custom MIME types for each version of our resource.
Ooh.
Yeah, whoever said that, yeah, absolutely. That's the first thing I said. I said, are you freaking kidding me? I can barely get Apache to recognize the 9 it's supposed to, let alone have to keep up with this. And if you follow Dr. Fielding's specification on the HTTP spec, MIME types were not meant to be created willy-nilly. They're supposed to be agreed upon communication between client and server. When I ask for a MIME type, I should know what to do with it. So this is a bastardization of that concept to say, oh, well, when I get this or versus that, it's going to look different. I absolutely abhor this. So to me, headers are out because the concept is out. But it's personal opinion. I mean, you absolutely need to go do some reading on your own. The other way you can do is you can set X API version and the version number. Okay, that's a heck of a lot better than this because it's a totally different concept. Except, does anybody know what this means?
Just an ad hoc.
Ad hoc, not part of the spec. Proxies that are going to strip headers, if you go to a betting person, they're sure as heck going to strip this one before they're going to strip some of the other ones, if they're inclined to do any stripping. There is absolutely no guarantee whatsoever that this header is going to make it to your client or be interpreted correctly. Are you going to pin your entire versioning of your API on a header that may or may not be supported or supported consistently? Not me. You can do it through the URI. You can say version equals 2. It works. I'm of the URI camp. That's where I think versioning should happen, and we're going to talk about why in a moment. I prefer the second one over the first one, and that's why you saw v.1.0 in my application. Because I want it to be as close to my API as possible. I understand underneath they're doing the same thing, but visually, it's too easy for somebody to say, and name equals, and this, that, and etc. Now, when you're searching a collection, you do pass in parameters this way. I'm not saying parameters are bad. You do pass in ranges and some of those search parameters. So, it's not bad, but I just don't like it.
I submit that you are actually doing something fundamentally different. Because in the first one, you're saying, this is my resource, and by the way, I want it to behave this way.
Right.
In the second one, you're saying, this is a different resource, and the difference happens to be the version.
You're absolutely right.
And so I define it as a different resource that, in your opinion, happens to be version 2.
Correct.
And that makes it to be a more valid.
Correct. They are absolutely two different schools of thought. And so far, I seem to be the only person in the second school of thought.
No, actually, Twitter, actually.
Oh, are they doing it this way?
They're implementing, yes. Their versioning is right after their domain.
For the last 7 months that I've been doing a REST API, I'm sure there's others, do not get me wrong, and I don't know everybody that's involved in this space, so, I say it with a lot less ego than it sounds like. But I've been the only person advocating this. And everybody else is like, no, you should do it this way. And I'm like, but you're doing it wrong. And here's why, in my opinion. What are you versioning? Are you versioning a representation of the resource? or are you versioning your application's business logic? That is the question. And that is the question that is very contentious in the REST community. In my opinion, you should be versioning your application's business logic, but simultaneously do not ignore representation changes of the resource. So, let's go through an example. Let's say we're ordering a book through an API. You used to get a receipt upon successful, the completion of your order. You used to get a receipt, but now you don't. Okay? It's a change to the business rules, right? But, I'm sorry, you used to not get a receipt, but now you do. I read my example wrong. Regardless, you didn't get a receipt, now you do. Your business rules changed. But you can accomplish that with a 303C other header. Because at the end of what used to be the end of your process in the consumption of the API, you now just go, oh, now I've got another header, and it takes them to the receipt page. So no big deal. You can change your application logic, and it's no big deal. Now, let's say you have a purchasing system. You used to get back a representation that contained order details, including like invoice numbers. So let's say you place an order, and you got back order details and an invoice number. But now, as part of the process, you have to specify payment options, whether it's a PO number or a net 30 or some sort of client account. You have, again, changed your business application. But you have also changed your interaction with your API. If you're just going computer to computer, you could argue not a whole lot's changed because a computer should just be dumb and follow links. But if you built an API, you built an iPad app that's consuming Twitter's API. Now suddenly the users have to be presented with payment options and make a decision. There's a different branch in the logic. From a resource standpoint, maybe nothing's changed. But for the workflow, for the consumption, it has. And to me, that's that previous slide. Is it your representation of your resource that changed, or was it your application's business logic? And one more example, and then we have another slide. Let's say you were performing a get on an employee resource, and you were getting back name and phone number. Now you've added an email address. What changed? Your business logic didn't change. Maybe you can argue it. I know we're getting a little bit into semantics here. But really what changed was the representation of your resource, because you've added a phone number or an email address or whatever the example is. So this is how I have solved the problem, is that I implement the concept of a major, minor, and revision versioning scheme. Anytime I'm going to have a change to my business process that fundamentally alters the way you interact with my API from a business application standpoint, from a workflow standpoint, that when I used to be able to do this, but now you don't even support it anymore, or now I'm going to have a totally different outcome underneath, that's a major change. Version 1 of my API to version 2 of my API. Major backwards compatibility break. New, just totally different underlying workings. However, if I just have a minor change in my representation, I had name and phone number, now I have name, phone number, and email. The version 1.0 was name and phone number. Version 1.1 is name, phone number, and email address. Because my consuming clients, they can still read the 1.1 format using the 1.0 rules they understood. They don't have to upgrade to 1.1 if they don't want to. They just can't get the email address. But that's fine. If their client doesn't need it, if their application doesn't need it, then why should they be forced to have to change things? I changed the representation of my resource, not the underlying business logic. And then, hopefully you're not using very many other revisions. Let's say when I added that email address, I realized that instead of an opening bracket, I screwed up and had a pipe symbol or some syntax, screwy thing, or I called my tag the wrong name. I'm going to have a revision number, 1.1.1. And I should be documenting all of this in my documentation. So when somebody comes to consume my REST API, they can look at it and say, oh, well, you know what, I don't even care about these 5 things over here, and it already sounds complicated. I'm just going to follow the 1.3 spec, even though I'm getting back 1.6 data. Then, because I have it built this way, you'll see in the code base, my code base is actually tied to my major version. I have version 1 of my API installed as an application on my server. When I make some major code changes, remember this is all dynamic underneath, or my business objects. If I am changing my business process underneath it. I don't even have an orders object anymore, the concept of ordering. How can I hope to continue to support it through the API if I don't even have the code, the database tables, the triggers, any of that stuff? It's another application. So version 2 of my application that my API sits on top of sits there. And then I can support version 1 as long as I want because it's still supported with the old architecture and the old data and the old whatever. I could immediately decide when 2 comes out, 1's dead, 30 days, 90 days, it lasts forever. I don't have to worry about simultaneously maintaining 2 completely polar opposite implementations under the same API auspice. Now, I am not standing up here telling you this is how you should do it, it's the only right way, etc., etc. But for me, this makes a hell of a lot more sense than anything else I've seen out there. People argue, oh, we got Google Maps, version 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, guess what you can do with Google Maps? You can get data. You can't order something. You're not generating invoices. There's not underlying business application changes that are impacting your consumption of their API. They can change their version number anytime they want. It's all about representation. Maybe there's some new features that they're considering a major change, but you're just constantly consuming. You're not interacting. So if you're writing a business application where you've got people pushing data in and out, recording sales, etc., to me, this is the type of separation that you need. But again, that's just me. Any questions? Yes, sir.
I can see that if you start to develop an API and add features, basically start small and get bigger, that you're just going to have a whole bunch of version numbers, something like that, major version numbers going on. Do you have any thoughts about that kind of stuff?
Personally, we haven't grown ours to the point where we ran into that yet. I have a friend who is on like their 3rd iteration of that kind of thing for that reason. You be careful, I guess is my advice. You don't want to enter into a full-fledged development of a full-fledged API without having done some other things correct first. Roadmaps, milestones, business objects, unit testing. So, those kinds of things that are going to keep your application, your business logic solid, so your API is solid. Yes, you might go through several iterations, and maybe in the beginning, every month you're coming out with a new version. But you shouldn't be coming out with a new major version, in my opinion.
Would you call a new feature?
Well, it depends. If it's if it's a new feature,
like a new URL, new object that you can access.
well, if it's a new resource, I'd probably do it as a. Ooh, that's a good question. I would lean towards minor, because to me, take any library that's out there, Symfony 1, 2, 2.1, 2.2, they are milestones, but 1 and 2 are fundamentally different. That's how I viewed it in my mind, even though I know I just said representation. Maybe it's more of a marriage. It's a specification, not a standard.
Sure.
Yeah, that's
If you're dealing with backwards compatibility issues, if you define a major as a non-backwards compatible, minor versus backwards compatible, if you add a new object, you're still 100% backwards compatible.
correct. Yeah. And I freely admit this probably needs some tweaking. But again, in my opinion, I think this is closer to what you need versus anything else I've seen out there. A little bit more work, because you got to keep track of this. We have different installations for each version. But again, to me, if I'm changing the way it works, I just added new objects. I removed a whole database table. I removed a vendor from the mix. I changed my application. To me, it's no big deal to have a separate installation of it. That way I can maintain both of them simultaneously. All right, so this is the actual code base then that I'm using. We'll go through it real quickly. If you go to github.com/notmessenger, I have all of it up there. And so the code we're going to look at is this code. So the reason I wrote my own is because when I started to do, look into REST, I went and looked at, and I'm not going to hit all of the libraries, I can't remember. There were several REST libraries. Some of the other frameworks had some. Zen REST exists as a module in Zen framework, and I was very used to like Zen Date and some of the other Zen modules. Going, I'm going to drop this in 5 minutes later, a piece of cake. Maybe I hop on the developer channel, ask a couple of quick questions, and good to go. Well, I dropped Zen REST in, and immediately discovered two things. right off the bat. One was it didn't support the ability to do the version in the URL the way I wanted to. So that was immediately out. Well, that's not true. I tried to extend their Zen REST route class. And I did that like 5 different ways, and that was getting me nowhere. Then I also discovered that out of the box, it only supports the concept of country and country/1. It couldn't support country/1/orders 18. It wouldn't let you do that sub-level and the sub-sub-level. So again, I was like, all right, fine, I'm going to extend their Zen REST controller, or the route. And I did that 5 different ways and was getting nowhere. So then I looked at GetFrappy, which is a very popular open source API framework. GetFrappy is fantastic if you're not trying to build a REST API onto an existing MVC stack. It wants to act as its own MVC stack. And so I was like, oh, come on, because otherwise I would have used it. If I had existing code lying around or starting from scratch, I would have used GetFrappy. They do a really good job of this, but it wouldn't work for what I needed. So I wrote my own REST implementation. And unfortunately, it's not just one little module you can drop in, because it deals with the controllers, it deals with the routers, it deals with the view scripts, it deals with bootstrapping. There's a couple other things too. So, all right. So this is the code. All right. So this is my Zen Framework application. My API, the entire API, is its own application. Now, in here, in the library, in my app, I have a system folder, and these are like my entities. I've got a country entity and my country service, and I can add countries and remove countries, etc. It's all put in here right now as part of the demo, but the idea would be that I could run my API application alongside my business application, and this could be consuming the services that are here. They don't necessarily have to be part of my API. In this particular case, I truly wrote my entire application as an API because, to me, the API was just how I was going to consume my services. Any server-to-server communication, client-to-server communication, code-to-code is all going to go through my API because I want one single point to go through. So that's what made sense for me. But you could just as easily have this be somewhere else, and then this API application be consuming those services or those objects. All right, so so officially we have 5 minutes. Do we need to be out of here at 9? Do I need to fly through it and then ask questions after, or is everybody okay like an extra 10 minutes? Okay, we'll go through the code. If anybody, we can stop or whatever. All right, so here is my, all right, who here is not familiar with Zen Framework? Okay, good. So a lot of this would make a lot of sense. And if it doesn't, holler out. So the stuff that's in public, all that stuff, the startup, it's all normal, et cetera, et cetera. I take that back. I also am using, I'm using Doctrine underneath. So I set up a few things for the auto loaders for Doctrine, that kind of stuff. I'm going to be writing a blog post that explains all this. The reason for it is because, again, I wanted that automatic generation of how my resources look. I didn't want to do any extra work. So it's a heck of a lot easier to ask for it right off of my service coming out of my entities than it was to hand write anything. Plus, Doctrine just freaking rocks. All right. So that's all the normal stuff. Here's my bootstrap. I've got namespaces, ADEF, blah, blah, blah. I'm using dependency injection as well, but we won't be caught up on that. Okay, so I'm initializing my routes. So I have to change some things about my routes. So I have to add support for the put handler. PHP, as a language by itself, you know how you have the request super variable, global variable thing, whatever it's called? Never refer to it by that name. And you've got get and you got post. There is no put. PHP at its core doesn't do put. If you want put, you've got to parse the standard in string yourself and figure out if it's put. Zen Framework helps you with that. But again, remember we talked about, Rust was this great idea and then browsers kind of screwed us? Even the language we love, that is the predominant web programming language on the planet, doesn't even natively support the concept of put. We're already starting behind the 8 ball on this. There's workarounds, no big deal. Do this, we're good to go. All right, so now we've got support for put. I get rid of my default routes. Then what I'm doing is I'm setting up 2 hostname routes. One of them is developer dot, and the other one is my API dot, because I'm serving both my documentation and my actual API off of the same application. Now, of course, if you're getting really big and popular, you need to scale one, not the other. You break those out. That's easy enough to do, et cetera, et cetera. But for the sake of the demo, I'm running them both out of here. So if I go to developer.test.local, I'm going to get a welcome to your API, request a key, sign up. And if I go to the other thing, you saw what we were looking at tonight. Okay. Then, and these are just coming from some information I have in our INI file. So if I go look here real quick, here's our application INI. I have developer.test, and I've got my API test. Remember I told you that my installation is tied to a version number? This is where my version number is coming from. And then based off of these settings, it's setting up all the routes and handling all that stuff automatically inside. Now, as you're looking through this code, could it be optimized? Absolutely. There are some corners of this code where you're like, holy crap, those are 9 view scripts and they shared 92% of the same code. Yep. If you go read the to-do, it's one of the things in there. It's now on GitHub. If you want to contribute, more than happy to let you. That's why I put it up there. Well, not so much that, but I want to be able to share it. Okay. But I do welcome contributions. All right, so I set up my routes. And again, this could be done in an INI file. This could be done a variety of different ways. Right now, they're just hard-coded in here. So we don't want to get hung up on, could it be better, just conceptually. So right off the bat, I'm setting up my base APIs. I'm setting up my countries. I'm setting up my individual country. These are all my routes. I have to give them names, and they have to be unique. Because down here, I'm chaining these routes back to that host name route. And I have to give it a unique name when I am naming it. And so when I needed to be able to have an optional country/1 and country/1 slash anything else, such as orders 12, I need to be able to support both of them. And that's what this is capable of doing. But they're both country routes, so that's why you've got this naming thing. That's all the reason that's there. And again, I'm going to be writing a blog post that explains all of this. So anyway, I had to set up some routes to handle all the different ways I want to do routing. Specifically the multiple levels and the versioning, neither of which Zen REST supports. Some normal stuff, blah, 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 and then I do some plugins. All right. This is a change module layout. That just tells me, depending on which module I'm in, what kind of layout I want to show. I don't need to wrap my API output with anything, so it's empty. My developer one's got the HTML and Dojo and all that pretty stuff. Blah, blah, blah. Not really terribly important, but that's what it is. All right. I need to be able to handle the accept header coming in, and I also need to be able to handle REST routing. So if I go now to my library, I go to my application, go to my engine, go to my plugins. Oops, excuse me, not plugins. That is correct, but that's not where I put it. I put it, it's a control button. Okay. Accept handler. All right, blah, blah, blah. All right, so I will accept a URI parameter over accept header. So remember what I can pass in, format, or a question mark format equals text XML, or whatever the case is. This allows for me to do my override. I support it. So I take my format, and I'm either going to grab it off of the URI, or I'm going to grab it out of the header. So if it's in the URI, it overrides what's in the header. Then based on that, I am going to look at the format, and I'm going to determine whether it's XML, JSON, P, JavaScript, or if it's JSON. And then I'm going to set my format parameter, which is something that's built into Zen Framework, so that way I can do context switching on it later. So I'm just doing a little bit of manipulation in the way Zen Framework works out of the box, so that way I can provide support for some overrides. That's all that is. REST routing is another controller plugin. And what I'm doing here is, something we didn't talk about. Let's say you're using software like a browser or something else that will only let you do gets and posts. It does exist, but you need to be able to put or delete. What can you do? You can actually send your payload over post, but you can use an XHTTP method override and say treat it as a put, treat it as a delete. Some proxies will only let get and posts through. So you can essentially package it up under one methodology, but have it treated as another. Now, what did I say earlier about these types of headers?
Not good stuff.
Yeah, not a fan of it. So I'll let you also specify an underscore method equals name value parameter on the URI, and it will take precedence. So that's all this is doing. It's taking care of, if I'm not a get, look and see if I'm trying to act as anything else. in theory, I probably should also say, if I'm not a get and you're a post, because I really don't want to let you send a delete on a put, because the only one that's valid according to the specification is post is the only one you can piggyback on. So as I'm talking, I already found something I need to go improve on. But that's the concept behind this plugin. So again, just doing some overrides right now, some basic overrides. All right, so those are my plugins. I have an action helper, and it is helping me with my parameters. And so this is going to say, am I asking for it in JSON, XML, whatever the case is. And so, what type of data is coming in? Is it XML, is it JSON, is it JSONP? What do I accept? And then I'm decoding that and paring it down to a format that's standard for the rest of my code. So if it's coming in as application JSON, then I'm going to do a JSON decode on it. If it's XML, then I'm going to run it through the Zenconfig XML module, which is phenomenal because that's all I had to do, and now I've got back data, and it's paring it down into a usable format for me. So I can support multiple formats coming in. And then I'm setting, I'm setting some body parameters because these are properties within Zen Framework, so I can use them later. So I try to utilize as much of the built-in Zen Framework capability as possible. Because again, I'm lazy. All right. And then if you send, notice, if you send JSON, XML, or posted data, I support it. Otherwise, you're going to get back an exception that's going to say unsupported content type provided, and it's a header. So I actually have my own exception object that will throw errors. And those errors take this and knows how to send back the correct header, knows how to put this in it, build a response back in the format you asked for. It'll do context switching. So if you ask for it in JSON, the error will come in JSON. If you ask for it in XML, it'll come in XML. It's going to come back with a request. It's going to say error, all that stuff. Everything that comes out of here is a correct REST response, all the way down to the errors. Okay, and that's just some view stuff, no big deal, blah, blah, blah. That's my logger, no big deal as well. I initialize my modules and my dependency injection container. All stuff that you need, but it's nothing that we need for the rest. Okay, so that's that. So now let's go look at our actual application. So I've got my modules. This is my API. Remember we talked about I have my developer that you can go to? I've also got my error. So let's look at the error real quick. So my error controller, it was easier to leave it in the default module because by default that's where the error controller sits. I tried tearing it out. It's possible to do. I just didn't need the grief. So I was okay just leaving it with the default module so I can handle my error controller. This is my error controller. I'm going to do my context switching. These are the contexts that I will support. Then I am passing it off to my view script. I've got a view script that's going to build my error. Because I'm doing context switching, I have a view script for each context. So this is my JSON error. This is my XML error, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what my, so that's pretty much it. Now, could I find a way to standardize some of this stuff? Yes, this is where we start getting into, well, wait a second, I start to see the replication. When you get into view scripts, it could be improved. But conceptually, it's absolutely solid. Except for you can do a delete over a cut off fix. All right, so that's the default module. So the meat of it, obviously, is the API. So when I go to my API, all by itself, right now, I don't support anything. If you just go to api.test.local, I don't even give you back a list of things you can do. You should, but right now I don't. That's it. I allow nothing. And we're going to talk about what that means in a moment. So let's actually go look at an individual country. First thing I do is I extend this. All right, fine. Let's go talk about that real quick. I have a resource class. This code was inspired in part by this resource library, which is an attempt to do a REST API inside the Zen framework. I liked about half of his approach. The other half, it didn't work and whatnot. And so I gave proper attribution and built my own based on some of the ideas and concepts and whatnot. So what this says is, I'm only going to allow for any resource in my entire application, this is all I'm ever going to allow. Get, put, post, delete, head, and options. It's not possible to do a trace. It's not possible to do a prop find at all, ever. I don't have to worry about implementing this on a controller-by-controller basis. I don't have to worry about having a team of developers and then forgetting to turn something off or on. That's all I'm going to support. I'm also only going to support these contexts for the context switching, because again, I'm doing XML, JSON, and JSON-P. Part of the initialization, when I'm doing my dispatch loop for the controller, is I'm setting up, I don't want my layout, because again, I'm sending out pure raw data. I don't need any fancy header and stuff. I'm setting up my context switch headers. I'm adding in my JSON-P capability here. Then I'm adding an action context for all of that. I mean, this is just standard context switching, as you can see here. And then this is, that's optional, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So there's some other stuff you're going to see. What happens if you don't support one of those, get, post, put, deletes? There's a not allowed method that'll be called. What am I going to do? I'm going to send back an allow header and tell you which stuff I do allow. And I'm going to send you a 501 not supported. And by default, nothing's allowed. Get, put, post. I mean, this is 100% locked down. That's my base controller. This does some other stuff. How do I send a head if you ask for a head? How do I send in options? That kind of stuff. All right. So my country controller. What can I do to my country? I can get, put, post, delete, options, and head. Countries. Remember the few that you can do with countries? Where am I at? Countries. I can only get options and head. Remember those responses when we did 8 options? We only got 3 back? This is where they came from. Okay. So, get. Because we're doing context switching, I know I'm taking the get header request and I'm mapping it to a get action. And I'm taking a put request and mapping it to a put action, and a delete, and a head, and an options. So I can stick with the controller action concept, and then the context switching works, and etc. Word of caution, in addition to those things in here we could optimize, if you're Twitter or Netflix, you are not writing your REST API in Zen framework. Let me just put that out there right now. Way, way too heavy. I would prefer you're not doing it in any MVC stack. You're going to implement REST conceptually, but you're going to do it a heck of a lot better than this. This is, hey, I've got a Zen framework application. I need to expose some of my data to somebody. Hey, I want to use REST because it's easy, it makes sense. Here we go. I can toss this REST module in, although it's not really a module. I can drop this in. I'm good to go. You'll be fine. You can do things to optimize Zen framework, etc. But do not plan on being a Twitter with this code base. It's just not going to happen. It'll fall apart. Okay, so remember when I asked for a specific country, I can pass in, the ID. So I'm going to go and get my ID. Just normal stuff. If it's not there, I'm going to throw an exception. I then have my country service. I won't bore you with all the doctrine stuff, but needless to say, when I say from my dependency injector container, get my country service, and I want you to then get by ID this country, it's going to return back to me a result. That result is either going to be null, at which point I'm going to throw 404 not found, or it's going to have data, at which point I'm going to pass it off to my view scripts. And I'm going to distill that out as a standardized object. And we'll look at those in a moment. Post is the same idea, except obviously here, because again, the way doctrine works, I'm creating a new country object, which is actually an entity in doctrine. I'm calling a bunch of my setters. Then I'm going to add a single country, because I can also do multiple, and it all talks to my service layer, and blah, blah, blah. So again, controller talks to your model, talks to your view. It's the same MVC concept. Putting and deleting, et cetera, no big deal. All right, so what do the view scripts underneath look like? Let's look at our view scripts for an individual country. Look at that. Isn't that fun? For every single resource you have. Again, talked about we can start to standardize some of this stuff. I wouldn't want 50 different resources without finding a way to consolidate all these into shared view scripts. All right, so let's look at the get XML. I call a get XML view helper because you do need some underlying stuff as well. I can pass in my data, and I want to pass in the node of my response object. So let's go look at those real quick, and then that's pretty much it. Where am I at? My library. I don't need my engine. Or excuse me, I need my engine. View helper. Here's my get XML view helper. All right, so I check to see if I have data. I check to see what my parent root node should be in my response. Throw some exceptions. I'm going to create a new standard class. I'm going to put my response code here as a parameter of the headers object. I'm then going to create another variable called vary on the headers object. then I'm going to actually set my response code based on that up here. If I have a vary header, which you can do some reading about, there's a URL somewhere in here. Then I'm going to actually take I'm going to build an XML payload. Remember that self URL? I got to figure out what I am. So check and see if I'm secure or not. That's my protocol. Then I'm going to get the base URL of my application. Remember that's back there in my application.ini. I'm also then going to strip off all the versioning off of it, and then I'm going to compare that to the actual URL that was requested, and a little bit of magic and blah blah blah, and that builds my self URL. Any other links I need. I've got this DOM-I library that I found that helps me build XML extremely easy because the simple XML is not simple. Then I can just attach to it very easily, and if I'm an object from this, blah, 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 blah. And then when I'm done, I render my XML result, and what you get back is what you saw. JSON works pretty much the same way, except for instead of doing XML builder in here, I am going to, that's not it. I'm building an object, blah, 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 and then, hey, I'm doing a JSON encode, and everybody's happy. And pretty much the same thing happens for the puts and the deletes. They're just some different logic. You set some different headers, that kind of stuff. When you get down to this level, this is where you have a lot of shared code that obviously can be optimized. But conceptually, there it is. So notmessenger.com has a link to this, or github.com/notmessenger. Feel free to email me any questions. I do plan on writing a blog post that explains all the design decisions that went into this. But feel free to use it. All the licensing stuff in there, it's free to use. Just be nice and say where you got it. But that is it. Now that you guys have been thoroughly bounced around in the rest world, if you have any questions, I'll be here for a while. But Chris is giving me the king back there, so get the last one in.
You mentioned Adam Code and others.
Yes.
There isn't really a standard for sending back collections or sending back stuff. So, any direction or anything to look at on that?
I tried to keep it as easy as possible. I mean, to me, this is easy. Now, it does not mean that when I start having to have nested whatever, but keep in mind, your request to countries, let's say countries, oh man, they have a list of states, they should be here. No, if there's related information in here, put a see other, show a related, say that this is a related. Here's the URL to the states for this country, and define it, saying these are states. Everything should be very distinct and very specific. You can go from here to states. It shouldn't contain the states. It should only contain references. So, in my opinion, and I haven't ran into anything terribly complicated yet, but in my opinion, there's no reason why your collection should ever be frustrating to you. They should just be a collection of more references to more details and more resources. They obviously can contain some information, but they don't need to contain everything. That's why that other resource exists. So that's probably my best piece of advice. And you can't be wrong. As long as you document it and you don't change things without telling your consumers, you're not wrong. What works for Netflix works for Netflix, and what works for Twitter works for Twitter. Well, you could argue about Twitter, but that's another story. You had a question?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be kind of like a relational database to where you can have like a table called countries, and then you can also have another table called states, and like U.S. states or something, and then you can relate those together. You don't necessarily then need all that. In
Correct.
The same,
Absolutely. And I'm not advocating you have to write your application in Doctrine, but if you use Doctrine to write it, where everything is contained in a core, each concept is an entity that has its own class, and you build it that way, then exposing your resources in your API is an absolute no-brainer, because you say, well, what kind of business objects do I have? Okay, how many of those do I want exposed via my API? And you pretty much already have your mapping done. With a few more things. I mean, ordering is going to transcend several and that kind of thing. You're almost there. Anything else? We really should have made this a drinking game. I should have picked a term. Nebraska, exactly. It would have made more sense by the end.
I don't think software wants to pay for the cab fees.
All right, well, that's all I have. Thank you very much.